There are secrets that the desert holds better than any vault. There are truths that the wind carries away, whispering among the cacti and the stones, as if it knew that certain things should not be revealed under the raw light of the sun. Here, where the heat distorts the horizon and makes mirages dance over the cracked earth, men learn that not all that glitters is gold, and not everything that hides deserves to be found. Sometimes curiosity is the costliest sin a man can commit. Thomas Mitchell was 52 years old when that woman showed up at his property, and he had seen enough of life to know when something wasn't right. Her hands, calloused from hard work, trembled slightly as she approached her porch, carrying a small, dark wooden box against her chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The midday sun punished mercilessly, but she seemed not to feel the heat, only the weight of what she carried. The dust kicked up by her horse's hooves was still settling as she dismounted, with careful, almost reverent movements. Thomas watched from the shadow of his balcony, sweat running down his sunburned face, as he tried to decipher the strange visitor. She didn't seem to be the type who used to pass through those barren lands. Her clothing, while simple, had the quality of someone who knew bigger cities, places where people didn't have to fight the desert every day just to survive. As she approached, Thomas noticed that her eyes carried the kind of fatigue that doesn't just come from the physical journey. It was the fatigue of someone who carries a burden too heavy for his shoulders, the kind of weight that makes a person languish inside while the body is still functioning. His hands clutched the box with desperate force, his knuckles white with tension, as if he feared it might slip out of his control at any moment. The dry wind blew between them, carrying the familiar smell of sage and parched earth, but there was something else in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of Thomas's neck stand on end. He had felt this before, in the moments that preceded serious problems. It was the kind of silence that comes before the storm, when even the animals stop making noise and seem to be waiting for something terrible. The woman stopped at the foot of the wooden steps that led to the porch, and for a moment they just stared at each other. Thomas could see the despair in her eyes, mixed with something that felt like relief, as if she had finally found what she was looking for, or perhaps as if she could finally get rid of something that had been plaguing her. Her clothes were covered in road dust, but she didn't seem to care about her own appearance. All his attention was focused on that box and the man in front of him. When she finally spoke, her voice came out hoarse, as if she hadn't used her vocal cords for days. The words came loaded with an urgency that made Thomas lean forward, trying to catch every syllable that the wind threatened to carry away. There was pleading in her voice, but also an iron determination that suggested she had traveled too far and suffered too far to accept a refusal. The sun continued its relentless march across the cloudless sky, casting short, hard shadows on the dry land. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that echoed through the barren hills before being lost in the void. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine, as if the desert itself was trying to warn him about something. But the woman in front of him seemed more frightening than any wild predator, not because of the physical threat she posed, but because of the weight of the mystery she carried with her. The box in his hands seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, as if it contained something that should not exist in this world of scorching sun and parched earth. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off her, mesmerized by the way the woman held her, as if it were both the most precious and the most dangerous thing he had ever touched. The dark wood of the box was polished by use, but there were scratches on its surface, marks that suggested a long and possibly violent history. Certain words have the power to change the course of a life forever. They arrive like stray bullets, pierce through the tension-laden air, and lodge in a man's heart, leaving scars that never completely heal. In the wilderness, where every word can mean the difference between life and death, men learn to weigh their words like gold on a scale. But sometimes despair speaks louder than prudence, and words come out like tears, impossible to contain, impossible to undo. The woman's voice cut through the hot air like a blade as she lifted the box toward Thomas, her hands shaking so much that he feared she would drop it. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, and there was such a deep plea in her gaze that Thomas felt his own heart tighten. It was the kind of despair he had seen only once before, in the eyes of his own wife during the last days of her life, when the fever consumed her, and there was nothing else he could do but hold her hand as she walked away from him forever. Her words echoed through the barren expanse like a lament. "Please, sir, keep it closed." She held out the box as if it were a sacred offering, but Thomas could see the relief beginning to spread across her face as soon as he uttered the words. It was as if a gigantic weight was being lifted from his shoulders, transferred to him through that simple request, loaded with hidden meaning. Thomas looked at the box with growing apprehension. The dark wood seemed to absorb sunlight instead of reflecting it, creating a deeper shadow than anything natural should produce. There was something wrong with that, something that made his survival instincts scream silently. He had spent decades in that hostile land, had faced sandstorms, attacks from wild animals and even more dangerous men, but he had never felt the kind of primal fear that this box aroused in him. Still, something in the woman's desperate expression touched him deeply. Thomas reached out slowly, feeling the surprising weight of the box as she transferred it to him. The wood was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been even under the scorching sun, and there was an almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to come from within. Thomas suppressed an involuntary tremor and held the box to his chest, unconsciously imitating the posture the woman had maintained throughout her approach. The woman took a few steps back, as if now that she had gotten rid of the box, she needed to keep her distance from it. Her tears finally began to run down her dusty face, leaving clean trails on her sunburned skin. There was gratitude in her eyes, but also a deep terror that hadn't completely disappeared, as if she knew she'd passed a terrible burden on an innocent man, but she had no choice in the matter. Thomas felt curiosity grow within him like a thirst in the desert. The box seemed to grab his attention, whispering silent promises of secrets revealed and mysteries solved. There was a small but elaborate lock in front of it, and Thomas could see that it was locked. Her hands began to move toward the lock almost on their own, driven by a compulsion that seemed to come from outside of her own will, but the woman saw the movement and stepped forward, extending a hand in a warning gesture. His voice came out like a desperate whisper carried by the wind. "No, please do not open it. Never open it." There was real panic in his voice now, the kind of terror that comes from first-hand knowledge about dire consequences. Thomas could see that she had struggled with the same temptation that now consumed him, and had lost that battle at least once. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, but Thomas no longer felt the heat. All his attention was focused on the box in his hands and the woman who was slowly retreating towards his horse. She seemed to be preparing for a quick departure, as if she feared that her continued presence might somehow contaminate or influence Thomas to do something they would both regret. There was urgency in her movements now, a rush that wasn't there when she had arrived. Thomas looked at the lock again, noticing details he had missed before. The metal appeared to be of a strange alloy, almost black, but with reflections that changed as the light hit it. There were symbols engraved around the lock, not letters he recognized, but marks that seemed to burn his eyes when he tried to focus on them directly. The lock itself seemed to be waiting, like a closed mouth holding words that could change the world if they were spoken. Temptation is a serpent that coils itself around a man's soul and whispers sweet lies in his ears until he can no longer hear the voice of reason. In the wilderness, where loneliness can consume a mind more quickly than thirst consumes the body, men learn that the greatest dangers do not always come from without. Sometimes they are born inside us, grow like weeds fueled by curiosity and arrogance until they become impossible to ignore. And when we finally gave in to these inner voices, we discovered that some doors should never have been opened. Thomas watched the woman mount her horse and walk away, leaving only a cloud of dust and the echo of her warnings in the hot air. He remained on the porch long after she disappeared over the horizon, holding the box to her chest and feeling her strange warmth spread through her clothes. With each passing minute, the compulsion to open the lock grew stronger, like an itch that could not be scratched, a thirst that could not be quenched. His fingers traced the outlines of the engraved symbols, and he swore he could feel something moving inside, something alive waiting to be released. For 3 days and 3 nights, Thomas resisted. He put the box in his closet, locked the door, and threw the key in a drawer. But he could hear her calling out to him through the wooden walls, a low whisper that seemed to come from far away, and at the same time from within his own mind. He tried to get busy with the chores of the farm, to fix broken fences, to tend to the few animals he still owned, but nothing could silence that seductive voice that promised extraordinary revelations if he had only enough courage to look. On the 3rd night, Thomas could no longer sleep. He got up from his sweaty bed and walked to the closet like a man in a trance. His hands trembled as he picked up the key, and he could feel his heart beating so hard, it felt like it was going to explode in his chest. The box was exactly where he had left it, but it seemed to be pulsing with a light of its own in the darkness of the closet. Thomas held her again, and this time he could swear he felt a heart beating inside her, a rhythm that didn't match his own. He walked over to his kitchen table and placed the box under the dim light of his oil lamp. The symbols seemed to dance in the flickering light, changing shape and meaning as he watched them. Thomas could feel cold sweat running down his back, but his hands moved inexorably toward the lock. The woman's voice echoed in his mind one last time, begging him not to open it, but his own curiosity had grown stronger than any warning. The lock mechanism gave way with a soft click that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. Thomas felt a wave of cold air escape from the box, carrying with it a smell he couldn't identify, something between withered flowers and rusty metal. His hands hesitated on the lid for a moment, the last vestige of sanity begging him to stop, but then curiosity completely won out, and he opened the box in one go. What Thomas saw inside made his world collapse around him like a sandcastle hit by a storm. There was no gold, no jewelry, no important papers as he had imagined. Instead, there was something that his mind refused to fully process, something that violated every law of nature that he knew. It was like looking at a piece of hell itself, a window to a place where reality worked according to different and terrible rules. The light of the lamp wavered and almost went out, as if the very presence of what was in the box was hostile to the ordinary light. Thomas felt his legs fail, and he clung to the edge of the table to keep from falling. His heart raced so much that he feared it would stop altogether, and a sharp pain pierced his chest as if he had been struck by a spear. The air around the box seemed to be distorting, creating heat waves that made everything shake and move in impossible ways. He tried to close his eyes but found that he couldn't look away. It was as if that thing had hypnotized him, caught in his alien and malevolent gaze. Thomas could feel his sanity crumbling around the edges, little bits of his mind detaching and being sucked into the box like dry leaves in a whirlpool. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His voice had been stolen along with his ability to think clearly. And then, just when Thomas thought he was going to pass out or die right there, he heard the sound of hooves rapidly approaching. The woman had returned. He could hear her screaming her name outside, her voice charged with panic and despair. She had somehow felt that he had yielded to temptation and had ridden all night to try to save him from the consequences of his fatal curiosity. Salvation sometimes comes riding a sweaty horse, carrying with it the weight of experience and the bitter knowledge of past mistakes. In the wilderness, where second chance is rarer than water in a dry well, men learn that redemption must be won through action, not intention alone. There are times in a man's life when he has to choose between his own destruction and accepting the help of someone who has already walked the same dark path and lived to tell the tale. Pride is a luxury that the convicts cannot afford to possess. The door to the cabin exploded inward as the woman kicked it with desperate force, her eyes immediately finding Thomas staggering beside the table with the box open before him. She didn't hesitate for a second. She shot across the room like a bullet and closed the lid of the box with a violent motion that made the entire table tremble. The sound of the lid closing echoed through the cabin like a prison gate being locked, and Thomas immediately felt a portion of the pressure in his chest subside, though his vision was still blurry and his hands still trembled uncontrollably. The woman turned the key in the lock with precise and experienced movements, her hands steady despite the obvious urgency in her actions. She muttered words in a language Thomas didn't recognize, harsh guttural sounds that seemed to have the power to calm the thing inside the box. As she spoke, Thomas could feel the atmosphere of the room slowly changing, the heavy, oppressive air beginning to dissipate like smoke blown away. His breathing gradually returned to normal, though his eyes still burned with the memory of what he had seen. When she finished her impromptu ritual, the woman turned to Thomas with an expression that mixed relief, anger, and deep sadness. His own hands trembled now, not from fear, but from exhaustion, as if closing that box had drained some of his life force. Thomas could see new wrinkles around her eyes, lines that hadn't been there 3 days before, as if every time she dealt with that damn thing, she aged years in a matter of minutes. It was the price he paid for knowing the secrets that the box held. She sat heavily in the chair opposite Thomas, still not taking her eyes off the box, as if she feared she might open up on her own at any moment. For several minutes, they remained silent, only the sound of their heavy breaths filling the space between them. Thomas wanted to ask 1,000 questions. He wanted to understand what he had seen, what it meant, where it came from. but the words seemed inadequate for the enormity of what he had experienced. How can a man describe the indescribable? How can you name what shouldn't exist? Finally, the woman broke the silence in a hoarse, tired voice. She told her story in painful fragments, revealing how she had inherited the box from her late husband, a man who had spent years searching for strange artifacts in the distant mountains. He had died shortly after finding the box, not from physical injuries, but as if his soul had been sucked out of his body. She had made the same mistake as Thomas. She had opened the box out of curiosity and had almost lost her sanity in the process. The woman explained that the thing inside the box was not of this world. It was a fragment of something bigger and more terrible, a window into a place where the laws of reality did not apply. Each time someone looked at it, it fed it with human energy, allowing it to grow stronger. If it were opened too many times or long enough, it could eventually open a permanent portal to the place it came from. She had spent years trying to find someone strong enough to resist temptation, someone who could keep the box without succumbing to curiosity. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility sit on his shoulders like a blanket of lead. He had failed the first test, but the woman had returned in time to prevent a greater catastrophe. Now she looked at him with a mixture of hope and despair, as if he were her last chance to find a suitable guardian for this terrible thing. Her next words were a whisper laden with pleading. She had tried to destroy the box, but found it to be indestructible. All they could do was keep it closed and away from curious people. The weight of the decision Thomas faced was greater than anything he had ever experienced. He could see the future stretching out in front of him in two distinct directions. One where he accepted the burden and spent the rest of his life fighting the temptation to open the box again, and another where he refused and forced the woman to continue carrying that terrible weight alone. His hands still trembled as he looked at the box, now silent and seemingly harmless on his kitchen table, but he could feel its presence as a constant itch in his mind. The woman waited for her answer, with the patience of someone who had learned that some decisions cannot be rushed. Outside, the night wind blew through the desert, carrying with it the distant sounds of coyotes and the creaking of parched wood. It was a night like any other in this barren land, but Thomas knew his life had changed forever. There was no going back to the way it was before. The box had become a part of him the moment he opened it, and now he had to decide whether he would be his guardian or his next victim. Some choices define a man for all eternity. They arrive disguised as simple moments, seemingly small decisions that carry the weight of entire worlds in their consequences. In the wilderness, where every day is a battle between life and death, men learn that the true measure of character is not in what we do when we have all the options in the world, but in what we choose when there are only difficult paths ahead of us. And sometimes accepting a burden is the only way to find the redemption our soul desperately seeks. Thomas stared at his own hands for a long moment, seeing the scars left by years of hard work under the relentless sun. Each brand told a story of resistance, of moments when he had chosen to continue when it would have been easier to give up. He had survived the death of his wife, the droughts that killed his flocks, the harsh winters that tested his resolve to the limit. Now at the age of 52, he faced perhaps the greatest test of his life, not of physical strength, but of moral and spiritual strength. The woman sat silently, watching him with eyes that had seen too much. Thomas could see the deep exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the weight of years carrying a secret that corroded the soul like acid. She had spent so much time on the run, looking for someone she could trust with this terrible burden, that she had forgotten what it was like to live without constant fear. Her hands rested on the table, but Thomas noticed that she kept her fingers always ready to reach for the box if necessary, a reflex developed through constant surveillance. Slowly, Thomas reached out his hands and covered hers. They were hard-working hands, calloused and marked by time, but still firm and reliable. When he spoke, his voice came out low but determined, charged with the certainty of a man who had found his purpose. He said he would accept to keep the box, not out of curiosity or desire for power, but because he understood now that some burdens must be carried so that others can live in peace. He had learned in his own skin the price of reckless curiosity, and that lesson had tempered his soul as iron is tempered by fire. The woman closed her eyes, and Thomas saw tears of relief stream down her dusty face. It was as if years of tension were finally being released from her shoulders, allowing her to hunch under the weight of exhaustion she had been hiding for so long. She whispered words of gratitude, but also of warning. reminded him that the temptation to open the box would never completely disappear. It would be a daily battle, a constant struggle between human curiosity and the need to keep the world safe from what was contained within the dark wood. Together they created a plan. Thomas would build a special hiding place on his property, a place where the box could remain hidden but under his constant surveillance. The woman taught him the words she had muttered to calm the thing inside the box, ancient sounds of a language that neither of them fully understood, but which seemed to have power over the evil entity. She also told him about the signs that indicated when the box was becoming restless, changes in temperature, barely audible whispers, the feeling of being watched even when he was alone. As the sun rose over the distant horizon, painting the sky golden and red, the woman prepared to leave for the last time. She looked different now, lighter, younger, as if getting rid of the box had restored years of her life. Thomas watched her mount her horse with movements that were now graceful rather than charged with despair. Before leaving, she turned to him one last time and said that she had finally found what she was looking for, not just a keeper for the box, but a man with the moral strength to resist her temptations. Thomas remained on the porch long after she disappeared over the horizon, the box now resting in his hands like a familiar weight. He could sense her evil presence, but it no longer frightened him in the same way. There was fear, yes, but also determination. He had found a purpose greater than his own solitary existence, to protect the world from something that shouldn't exist. It was a responsibility he would carry until his last day, a daily battle that he would wage in silence so that others could live without knowing the terror he had witnessed. In the years that followed, Thomas became known in the region as a changed man. Some said that loneliness had finally affected his mind, for he spoke to himself at times and seemed to be always on the alert, as if waiting for some unseen danger. But those who knew him best noticed a deeper change. There was a serenity in him now, a peace that comes from accepting a destiny greater than oneself. He had found his redemption not through glory or recognition, but through the silent sacrifice of his own tranquility for the good of humanity. And in the silence of the desert, where the wind carries secrets across the miles of barren land, Thomas Mitchell continued his solitary vigil. The box remained closed, its terrible secrets contained by the iron will of a man who had learned that true courage lies not in facing the unknown, but in protecting others from it. Some battles are fought quietly, away from the eyes of the world, by men who choose to carry heavy burdens so that others can sleep peacefully under the endless stars of the night sky. If you've made it this far, it means that our journey through the Wild West has touched your heart as much as it has touched ours. Stories like Thomas Mitchell's deserve to be shared with other adventurers who appreciate deep and exciting storytelling. Leave a comment telling us which part impacted you the most. Was it the moment Thomas opened the box, the mysterious arrival of the woman, or perhaps his final decision to accept the burden? His opinion is the fuel that motivates us to continue exploring the secrets hidden in the arid lands of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming adventures we have prepared for you. Together, we will discover more stories that only the desert can tell.